The once bustling city had been reduced to a wasteland, its streets littered with the decaying remains of the unfortunate. Within a fortified compound, a small group of ragged survivors clung to life, their nerves frayed and their hope fading with each passing day. Sarah, a former military strategist, watched helplessly as her people succumbed one by one to the relentless horde of zombies that surrounded them. The compound, once a beacon of safety, now felt more like a prison. The towering walls that had once protected them now kept them trapped, with no way to escape the growing menace outside. Sarah paced the perimeter, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of relief, but all she saw was a sea of lifeless, soulless eyes staring back at her. The group huddled in the dimly lit common area, their faces haggard and their spirits broken. They had fought so hard, so long, but the zombies just kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. The sound of their moans and the scraping of their nails against the walls was a constant, unnerving soundtrack that permeated every waking moment. Sarah knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Supplies were dwindling, and the strain of fighting off the undead was taking a heavy toll on her people. She had lost so many already, good people who had trusted her to keep them safe. The guilt weighed heavily on her, and she found herself questioning every decision she had made. As night fell, the compound grew eerily quiet, save for the occasional scream that pierced the darkness. Sarah stood at her post, her eyes trained on the gates, her hand gripping her weapon tightly. She knew that the zombies were out there, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when the survivors' defenses would falter. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the distance, and Sarah's heart raced as she saw a figure stumbling towards the gate. It was one of her people, his clothes torn and his face covered in blood. Sarah rushed to the gate, yelling for the others to help her. "Open the gate," she cried, her voice hoarse with panic. "He's hurt. We have to help him." The others hesitated, their eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. They had lost so many already, and the thought of letting a potential zombie into their sanctuary was too much to bear. "Please," Sarah begged, her desperation palpable. "We can't just leave him out there." After a moment of tense silence, the gate creaked open, and Sarah and the others pulled the injured man inside. He was barely conscious, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the extent of his injuries. "Zombies," the man whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "So many of them. They got the others." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the implication of his words. The others, her people, her friends, were gone, taken by the relentless horde that surrounded them. "No," she breathed, the weight of her failure crushing her. The man's eyes flickered, and he reached up to grab Sarah's arm. "You have to get out of here," he rasped. "They're coming. They're coming for all of us." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. Escape. Was that even possible? The compound was their only refuge, their only hope of survival. But if the zombies had breached their defenses, then they were truly in grave danger. She looked around at the faces of her people, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. They were all thinking the same thing. Could they really escape the compound and survive the onslaught of the undead? Sarah took a deep breath, her mind made up. They had to try. They couldn't stay here and wait for the inevitable. It was time to make their move, before it was too late. As the gravity of their situation sank in, Sarah knew they had to act quickly. The injured man's warning had only confirmed what she had suspected. The zombies were closing in, and their compound was no longer a safe haven. Gathering the survivors, Sarah called an emergency meeting. Her people looked to her with a mixture of hope and trepidation, their faces etched with the strain of their ordeal. "We can't stay here any longer," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The zombies have breached our defenses, and it's only a matter of time before they overrun us." A hush fell over the group, broken only by the muffled moans of the undead outside. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that their sanctuary had become a trap. "But I've heard rumors of a safe zone on the other side of the city," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her people. "It's a risk, I know, but it may be our only chance at survival." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Sarah's words hanging heavy in the air. They had endured so much, lost so much, and the thought of venturing out into the zombie-infested city was almost too much to bear. "How can we be sure it's safe?" One of the survivors, a young woman named Amelia, spoke up. "What if it's just another trap?" Sarah met Amelia's gaze, her expression grave. "I can't guarantee anything," she admitted. "But we can't stay here and wait for the zombies to tear us apart. Our only hope is to try and reach this safe zone, no matter the cost." Amelia's brow furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew Sarah was right, that they had no choice but to take this risk. But the fear of the unknown, the very real possibility of not making it, was almost overwhelming. "What's the plan?" another survivor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing as she formulated their strategy. "We'll need to fortify our vehicles, stock up on supplies, and wait for the cover of night. The zombies are less active then, and we may have a better chance of slipping through the city unnoticed." The survivors nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They knew the risks, the danger that awaited them, but they also knew that staying in the compound was no longer an option. As they scattered to prepare for their perilous journey, Sarah stood alone, her heart heavy with the weight of their decision. She had led them this far, but now she was asking them to put their lives in her hands once more. The thought was almost more than she could bear, but she steeled her resolve. She would not let them down, not this time. With a deep breath, Sarah joined the others, her own fear pushed aside as she focused on the task at hand. They would reach the safe zone, no matter what it took. Failure was not an option. As night fell, the air in the compound grew thick with tension. The survivors, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination, gathered around the battered vehicles they had hastily fortified. Sarah stood before them, her expression grim but resolute. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've done everything we can to prepare, but I won't lie. The journey ahead will be dangerous, and there's no guarantee we'll make it." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her people. "But I believe in all of you, and I know that together we have a fighting chance. We've survived this long, and we're not going to give up now." The survivors nodded, their hands gripping their weapons tightly. They had come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. With a deep breath, they climbed into the vehicles, their hearts pounding as they prepared to venture out into the unknown. As the convoy rumbled to life, Sarah took one last look at the compound, her eyes lingering on the familiar walls that had once provided them with a sense of safety. But now, those walls felt more like a prison, keeping them trapped in the path of the relentless horde. "May the gods be with us," she whispered, before climbing into the lead vehicle and taking her place behind the wheel. The journey through the city was a harrowing one, with the survivors forced to navigate a maze of abandoned cars and the decaying remains of those who had not survived the onslaught. The zombies lurched towards them at every turn, their soulless eyes fixed on their prey. Amelia, her face set in a grim determination, manned the turret of the lead vehicle, her weapon blazing as she fought to clear a path for the convoy. The sound of gunfire and the screams of the undead filled the air, and the survivors found themselves gripping the seats, their knuckles white with tension. At one point, a horde of zombies swarmed the convoy, and Sarah was forced to take evasive action, weaving the vehicle through the chaos as her people fired frantically from the windows. Miraculously, they managed to break free, but not without casualties. As they pressed on, the survivors found themselves facing increasingly daunting obstacles. Abandoned cars, debris, and the sheer numbers of the undead made their progress painfully slow, and the strain of the journey began to take its toll. Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart sinking as she saw the anguish etched on the faces of her people. They had come so far, and yet the destination seemed impossibly far away. But she refused to give up, her determination fueled by the knowledge that the alternative was unthinkable. With gritted teeth, she pressed on, her eyes focused on the faint glimmer of hope that lay ahead. They had to make it, no matter what. The further they ventured into the ruined city, the more daunting the obstacles became. The streets were a maze of abandoned vehicles and the rotting remnants of those who had not survived, and the zombies lurched towards them at every turn, their moans and the scraping of their nails against the metal of the vehicles a constant, unnerving soundtrack. Amelia, her face set in a grim determination, manned the turret of the lead vehicle, her weapon blazing as she fought to clear a path for the convoy. The sound of gunfire and the screams of the undead filled the air, and the survivors found themselves gripping the seats, their knuckles white with tension. Sarah gritted her teeth, her focus unwavering as she navigated the treacherous terrain. She knew they were running low on fuel and supplies, and the strain of the journey was taking a heavy toll on her people. But she refused to give up, her determination fueled by the knowledge that the alternative was unthinkable. As they pressed on, the survivors were forced to confront the harsh realities of their situation. One by one, their comrades fell, their screams echoing through the eerie silence as the zombies tore them apart. The grief and horror was almost overwhelming, and the survivors found themselves questioning their decision to embark on this perilous journey. Amelia, her eyes hard with resolve, continued to lay down a hail of fire, her weapon never faltering. She had lost so much, but she refused to let it break her. They had come too far to turn back now. Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart sinking as she saw the anguish etched on the faces of her people. They had dwindled in number, their ranks thinned by the relentless onslaught of the undead. But she refused to let their sacrifice be in vain. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice ragged with emotion. "For them, for all of us. We can't give up now." The survivors nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They knew the risks, the danger that awaited them, but they also knew that staying in the city was no longer an option. With a deep breath, they pressed on, their eyes fixed on the horizon. As they neared their destination, the survivors were confronted by a sight that made their blood run cold. A horde of zombies, so vast and relentless that it seemed to stretch on endlessly, blocked their path. Sarah stared at the seething mass of undead, her mind racing. They had come so far, but now, it seemed, they had reached the end of the line. The safe zone, their last hope of salvation, was within reach, but the zombies stood in their way, an impenetrable barrier that threatened to crush their dreams of survival. The survivors exchanged anguished glances, the weight of their situation bearing down on them. They had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and now, it appeared, their efforts had been for naught. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she contemplated their next move. They had to get through, no matter the cost. Failure was not an option. As the survivors stared in horror at the vast horde of zombies blocking their path, Sarah knew they were facing their greatest challenge yet. The safe zone, their last hope of salvation, lay tantalizingly close, but the sea of undead bodies that stretched out before them seemed impenetrable. Sarah's mind raced, desperately searching for a way through. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to be stopped now. Failure was not an option. Amelia, her eyes narrowed with determination, turned to Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way we can fight through that. We'll be overrun in seconds." Sarah nodded, her jaw set in a grim line. "I know, but we have to try. We can't just give up now." The other survivors watched the exchange, their faces etched with fear and resignation. They had witnessed the horrors of the city, had seen their comrades torn apart by the relentless horde. The thought of facing that again was almost too much to bear. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind working furiously. There had to be a way, some kind of strategy they could employ to get through the horde unscathed. And then it hit her. "I have a plan," she said, her voice low and resolute. "But it's risky, and I'll understand if you don't want to go through with it." The survivors exchanged uncertain glances, but they knew they had no other choice. Staying where they were was a death sentence. With a nod, they turned their attention to Sarah, ready to hear whatever plan she had devised. "We need to draw the horde away from the safe zone," Sarah explained, her eyes burning with determination. "If we can lure them in a different direction, it might give us a chance to slip through and reach the sanctuary." Amelia's brow furrowed, her mind quickly working through the implications of the plan. "But how?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "How do we do that without getting overrun ourselves?" Sarah's gaze met Amelia's, her expression grave. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "I'll lead the horde away, and you and the others can make a break for the safe zone." The survivors stared at her, their eyes wide with disbelief. "No, Sarah, you can't," Amelia cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "We can't just leave you behind." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder, her grip reassuring. "You have to," she said, her voice laced with a sense of finality. "It's the only way. I won't let all of your sacrifices be for nothing." Amelia opened her mouth to protest, but Sarah silenced her with a firm shake of her head. "This is my choice," she said, her eyes shining with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I'm asking you to trust me one last time." The survivors stared at Sarah, their hearts heavy with the weight of her decision. They knew, deep down, that she was right. It was the only way. But the thought of leaving her behind, of watching her face the horde alone, was almost too much to bear. With a heavy sigh, Amelia nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll do it." Sarah gave her a small, reassuring smile, then turned to the others. "Get ready," she said, her voice steady. "As soon as I draw the horde away, you make a break for the safe zone. Don't look back, no matter what." The survivors nodded, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that this was it, their last, best chance at survival. With a deep breath, they prepared to make their final push towards the sanctuary. And as Sarah turned and headed out into the sea of undead, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken, the survivors watched, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and sorrow, knowing that they might never see her again. Amelia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she watched Sarah disappear into the seething mass of zombies. The sound of her friend's anguished cries still echoed in her ears, and the weight of her sacrifice threatened to crush her. But Amelia knew they had no choice. Sarah had made her decision, and the only way to honor it was to push forward, to reach the safe zone no matter the cost. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she turned to the remaining survivors, her voice trembling. "We have to go. Now." The others nodded, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and determination. They had lost so much, but they refused to let Sarah's sacrifice be in vain. With a collective deep breath, they started the engines and began to move, their vehicles rumbling through the abandoned streets. The journey was harrowing, with the survivors forced to navigate a maze of debris and the ever-present threat of the undead. Amelia's heart raced as she maneuvered the vehicle, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the safe zone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they caught a glimpse of the fortified walls in the distance. Relief and exhaustion washed over the survivors, and they pushed their vehicles to their limits, desperate to reach the sanctuary. As they approached the gates, Amelia could feel the tension building. Would they be welcomed, or would they be turned away, forced to face the horrors of the city once more? The gates creaked open, and a group of survivors emerged, their faces a mixture of caution and curiosity. Amelia and the others stumbled out of their vehicles, their bodies bruised and battered, but their eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Please," Amelia gasped, her voice hoarse. "We need help. We're the only ones who made it." The other survivors exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they took in the ragged, weary group before them. Without a word, they ushered the newcomers inside, their gestures warm and welcoming. Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her as she crossed the threshold, the familiar sounds of the safe zone enveloping her. It was a far cry from the desolation they had just escaped, and the contrast was almost jarring. As the others tended to their wounds and shared their harrowing tale, Amelia found herself drawn to the quiet corners of the compound, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. Sarah's sacrifice weighed heavily on her, and she knew that the grief and guilt would never truly fade. But in the faces of the other survivors, Amelia saw a glimmer of hope. They had made it, against all odds, and that was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. With a deep breath, she joined the others, determined to honor Sarah's memory by fighting for the life they had been given. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but Amelia knew that they were not alone. In this sanctuary, they had found a community, a family, and together, they would rebuild, one step at a time. In the aftermath of their harrowing journey, the surviving members of the group found themselves grappling with the weight of their experiences. The grief and trauma of witnessing the loss of their comrades, their friends, weighed heavily on their minds, and the sense of guilt and uncertainty threatened to consume them. Amelia, now the de facto leader of the group, found herself at the center of it all. She had watched Sarah sacrifice herself to ensure their escape, and the memory of her friend's last moments haunted her every waking hour. The burden of guiding the others, of helping them pick up the pieces, was overwhelming. But Amelia knew she couldn't falter. As the survivors settled into the relative safety of the fortified compound, Amelia set to work, her mind laser-focused on the task at hand. She knew they needed to fortify their defenses, to establish a sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos that had consumed their lives. The other survivors, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve, followed Amelia's lead, their hands calloused and their eyes hardened by the trials they had endured. Together, they scavenged for supplies, reinforced the walls, and organized a system of patrols, and watched shifts to ensure the safety of their newfound sanctuary. As the days turned into weeks, the survivors began to find solace in the camaraderie of their community. In the shared experiences of loss and survival, they forged a bond that transcended the horrors they had faced. Slowly, they began to heal, finding comfort in the routine and the familiar faces that surrounded them. Amelia, however, struggled to find her own peace. The weight of her responsibilities, combined with the haunting memories of their journey, threatened to overwhelm her. She found herself withdrawing, her thoughts consumed by the what-ifs and the could-have-beens. One evening, as she stood guard along the compound's walls, staring out into the darkness, a familiar figure approached her. It was one of the other survivors, a man whose name she had barely registered in the chaos of their arrival. "You're carrying a heavy burden, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft and understanding. Amelia turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and vulnerability. I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not a leader, I'm just trying to survive." The man nodded, his expression compassionate. "You're doing better than you think," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We all are. We're alive, and that's thanks to you, and to Sarah." Amelia felt a lump rise in her throat at the mention of her friend's name, and she struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I wish she was still here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish I could have done more." "You did what you could," the man said, his grip on her shoulder tightening. "And that's enough. We're grateful, Amelia. We're all grateful." Amelia nodded, her eyes finally meeting the man's gaze. In that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders, her resolve renewed. "We'll honor her memory," she said, her voice steadier. "And we'll keep fighting, for her and for all of us." The man smiled, his eyes shining with a newfound respect for the young woman before him. Together, they turned their gaze towards the horizon, their hearts filled with a cautious optimism for the future. As the days turned into weeks, the small group of survivors began to settle into their new life within the fortified walls of the safe zone. The weight of their harrowing journey still hung heavy on their minds, but the sense of community and the promise of a new beginning slowly began to ease their burdens. Amelia, though still haunted by the memory of Sarah's sacrifice, found herself emerging as a natural leader. Her unwavering determination, combined with a keen eye for strategy and an unwavering commitment to the group's well-being, quickly earned her the respect and admiration of her fellow survivors. Under Amelia's guidance, the group set about the task of rebuilding their lives. They scavenged for supplies, fortified their defenses, and established a system of patrols and watch shifts to ensure the safety of their sanctuary. The rhythms of their new existence provided a sense of normalcy, a welcome respite from the chaos and terror that had defined their recent past. Yet, the survivors knew that the fight was far from over. The zombie threat still loomed, a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. But with each passing day, they grew stronger, more resilient, and more resolved to meet the challenges that lay ahead. Amelia, in particular, found herself driven by a newfound sense of purpose. She knew that Sarah's sacrifice had not been in vain, and she was determined to honor her friend's memory by ensuring the survival and well-being of the group. Her leadership, once tentative and uncertain, blossomed into a confident and unwavering resolve that inspired those around her. As the months passed, the once ragged group of survivors began to transform. They established a thriving community, with gardens, workshops, and even a rudimentary medical facility. The safe zone, once a mere refuge, became a beacon of hope in the midst of the devastation that surrounded them. Amelia, now the undisputed leader of the group, watched over her people with a fierce protectiveness. She knew that the challenges they faced were far from over, but she also knew that they were stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. In the quiet moments, when the bustle of the community faded and the night watchmen took their posts, Amelia would often find herself drawn to the edge of the compound, staring out into the darkness. It was there, in the stillness, that she would remember Sarah and the countless others who had sacrificed their lives to ensure the survival of the group. "We won't let your sacrifice be in vain," Amelia would whisper, her voice carried away by the gentle breeze. "We'll keep fighting, for you and for all of us. This is our home now, and we'll defend it with everything we have." And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the survivors of the zombie war continued to rebuild, their hearts filled with a newfound determination and a resolve that would not be broken. They knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but they also knew that they had each other, and that together they could weather any storm.